There are some cases that terrify you because of what the killer did. And then there are cases that stay with you because of how long the world allowed it to continue. This is one of those stories. For years, young men vanished along the roads of northern France. Fit, handsome, disciplined, often on the threshold of military life. The kind of sons families expected to come home by Sunday night. Instead, they seemed to dissolve into the landscape. No witnesses, no confessions, no answers. Just empty rooms, unanswered letters, and parents forced to live in the unbearable space between hope and grief. For 16 years, France wrestled with a question that felt as haunting as it was absurd. Why would anyone hunt this specific kind of victim over and over again with such patience and such control? The answer, when it finally began to emerge, was stranger than rumor, darker than speculation, and tied to a man no one had expected to fear. Our story begins on August 8, 1987. In a wooded area near a highway in northeastern France, a farmer walking with his dog noticed the animal suddenly lunge toward a patch of disturbed earth. The dog clawed frantically at the ground until something pale emerged from the soil. At first, it looked like a hand. Then, slowly, horrifyingly, it became clear this was not a fragment. It was a buried body. Police arrived to find the victim was a young man. He'd been beaten, restrained, and strangled. Marks around the neck told one part of the story. Bruising across the body told another. But what investigators did not find was almost more unsettling than what they did. There were no obvious signs of a chaotic fight, no defensive wounds that suggested a desperate struggle against an attacker of equal force. It looked less like a spontaneous killing and more like a controlled event. One person dominating another with terrifying certainty. The victim carried almost nothing that could identify him. No passport, no license, no clean trail back to a family waiting for news. But near the burial site, investigators found a work card linked to a company in Ireland. When they called the number, a woman answered and casually said the man on the card was fine. He was in a meeting. Then came the pause. Then the instinct that something was wrong. When police admitted they had found a murdered young man in France, the woman broke down. The card, she said, was hers. Her brother had borrowed it. The victim, they soon learned, was 20-year-old Trevor O'Keefe, an Irish traveler making his way through Europe. Trevor had last been seen days earlier. He told friends he was heading toward Calais, and he planned to get there the way so many young men did in that era, by hitchhiking. It was cheap, common, and dangerously dependent on trust. Somewhere between departure and destination, Trevor climbed into the wrong vehicle. Somewhere on that road, he encountered a man who did not see a traveler in need of a lift, but an opportunity. As police reconstructed Trevor's final days, an even more chilling detail surfaced. Only months earlier, another young man had been discovered buried in almost the same way, near the same stretch of highway. His name was Olivier. He too had been strangled. He too had been hidden in the earth, as if the killer believed the ground itself could be made complicit. Suddenly, investigators were no longer staring at a single murder. They were staring into the possibility of a pattern. That possibility became unbearable when detectives widened the lens and looked backward. Across previous years, other young men had vanished while traveling to or from military service in the same region. Many had been dismissed as deserters. The assumption was easy, bureaucratically convenient, and devastatingly wrong. Families who insisted their sons would never willingly disappear were brushed aside. Their poverty made them easier to ignore. Their certainty was treated like denial. While official records implied runaway soldiers, grieving parents kept begging for someone to consider the darker possibility that their sons had not fled anything at all. They had been taken. Once that theory took hold, the case changed shape. The victims were not random in the usual sense. They shared an age range, a physicality, a moment in life. They were young, able-bodied, often athletic, often tied directly or indirectly to the military. The road became more than a roadway. It became a hunting ground. And the killer, whoever he was, seemed to understand exactly when these young men would be vulnerable, isolated, and eager to accept help from a stranger. A criminal psychologist was brought in to sketch the mind behind the murders. The profile he offered was as unsettling as it was specific. The offender, he believed, was likely someone with military familiarity, possibly active, possibly former service, someone who understood troop movement, knew the rhythms of leave and return, and chose victims on Thursdays and Fridays when young men were most likely to be traveling between home and barracks. But the profile went further. This was not a man primarily motivated by theft. This was someone driven by domination, humiliation, ritual, and unresolved rage. A predator whose violence was about possession more than profit. Investigators chased leads for months. They questioned criminals, drifters, transport workers, anyone who crossed those roads. They looked into highway robberies. They explored gang activity. They even examined another serial offender operating near the Swiss border, only to rule him out when the method, geography, and timeline failed to fit. The case kept widening, but the killer remained just outside the reach of certainty. Then, in August 1988, nearly by accident, the case cracked open. During a routine patrol on a French highway at night, officers noticed a small van parked off the road. It did not look dramatic. Nothing about it screamed horror. But routine policing has a strange way of brushing up against buried evil. The officers approached the driver, who was calm, respectful, and cooperative. He identified himself as a member of the military. Everything about him seemed orderly, controlled, harmless, until one officer noticed another man lying in the back. The driver claimed the man was just a hitchhiker, resting. The officers were not convinced. They ordered the van opened, and when the rear door swung wide, the illusion ended. The hitchhiker inside was not sleeping. He was bound, terrified, barely able to explain in broken French what had happened to him. He had been picked up on the road, overpowered, tied, and taken captive by the very man now trying to pass the encounter off as some private misunderstanding. That driver was Pierre Chenal, a French army non-commissioned officer, decorated, respected, predictable on paper, unthinkable in reality. When questioned, Chenal insisted the bound man was his willing lover and that the restraints were consensual. It was the kind of explanation designed not to persuade, but to muddy the air, to introduce enough discomfort and ambiguity that others might step back from the truth. But one seasoned investigator did not step back. The moment he saw the file, heard the roadside officer's account, and looked into Chenal's service background, he felt the entire case shift beneath his feet. Because Chenal's military timeline overlapped with the disappearances. Because he knew the region. Because he traveled the same roads. Because the pattern that had seemed abstract for so long suddenly had a body, a rank, and a name. Police tore through the van, and what they found did not belong in the vehicle of a normal man. There were ropes, blankets, chains, assorted men's underwear in different sizes and brands, a filthy mattress in the back stained with hair, bodily traces, and the residue of prior violence. The van was not transportation. It was infrastructure, a mobile environment built around control, an engine of private terror. At Chenal's residence, investigators found more material that deepened the sense of organized deviance. But even then, the case was maddeningly incomplete. They were certain he was dangerous. They were increasingly convinced he was their killer. But certainty is not the same thing as proof. And in the late 1980s, forensic science was not yet ready to give them what they needed. The evidence was there. The ability to speak for it was not. So the years dragged on. Chenal was prosecuted for the kidnapping and sexual assault of the surviving hitchhiker, Balázs Falvai, and on that charge, he was convicted. But the larger shadow remained untouched. The missing soldiers, Trevor O'Keefe, the bodies, the burials, the families waiting for France to finally say out loud what they had known in their bones all along. And then came the decision that now feels almost impossible to hear without anger. After serving only part of his sentence, Chenal was released. Released! A man suspected of being connected to a chain of disappearances and killings was allowed back into the world, while families still carried photographs of sons who never came home. Public fury grew. Pressure mounted. The case became a symbol not just of murder, but of institutional failure, of military indifference, investigative delay, and a justice system that seemed perpetually one step behind the man it should have stopped years earlier. Eventually, as DNA technology advanced, old evidence was re-examined. Hair recovered from the mattress in Chenal's van was tested. Soil found on a shovel in his possession was compared against burial sites. At last, science began saying what suspicion had screamed for years. The traces linked Chenal to Trevor O'Keefe. They linked him to other victims. The dead finally had a language. By the time the case moved toward trial again in 2003, France was no longer asking whether Pierre Chenal might be involved. The real question had become how many lives had been swallowed by the years it took to corner him. But even then, the story refused to end cleanly. Before judgment could fully close around him, Chenal killed himself in prison. One final act of control, one final theft, from the court, from the victims' families, from history itself. He denied the public a full reckoning and denied investigators the possibility of answers that may have died with him. And that may be the cruelest part of all. Not just that young men disappeared. Not just that, many were dismissed as runaways or deserters. But that the man believed to be behind it all understood systems better than the people chasing him. He knew the roads. He knew the military world. He knew vulnerability. And for years, he moved through official structures not as a suspect, but as a soldier, disciplined, decorated, and trusted. To the outside world, his victims looked similar enough to form a pattern. Young, strong, attractive. In the age of service and conscription, they represented a very specific image of masculinity, discipline, and youth. Whatever fantasy or fury lived inside Chenal, it appears to have fastened itself to that image with deadly consistency. He did not simply pick people. He selected a type. He hunted a category. And that is what transformed this from a string of disappearances into something colder and more calculated. A private compulsion repeated until chance, not brilliance, finally interrupted it. The roads of northeastern France still exist. Cars still pass through those corridors of fields and forest without ever sensing what memory lingers there. But for the families of the missing, those roads are not scenic routes. They are unfinished sentences. They are the last known direction, the last phone call, the last station, the last hitchhiked ride. This case endures because it was never just about one killer. It was about the vacuum around him, the assumptions that protected him, the bureaucracy that mislabeled victims, the years lost waiting for institutions to admit that disappearance can be murder in slow motion. Pierre Chenal may have died before a full verdict could be heard, but the shape of the horror remains unmistakable. A predator in uniform, a nation late to believe its own dead, and a trail of boys and young men who vanished simply because they trusted the wrong driver on the wrong road at the wrong time. This was not merely a mystery. It was a failure stretched across 16 years. And in that failure, a monster found room to keep going. This has been the Obsidian Index.